Good morning. How's everybody doing? I'm going to put you on my drawing. Yeah, that doesn't work. I guess I'll put you right here. So, I thought I've got a few minutes. Yes, I'm verified on Twitter. By the way, the reason I wasn't verified on Twitter before, it's not because they don't love me. It's because I never filled out the paperwork. It was one of those tasks where I knew it would take, 15 minutes to fill out the paperwork to get verified. And a million times I told myself, I think I'll fill out that paperwork. But each and every time I thought it, I didn't have 15 minutes. And all the times I had 15 minutes, I didn't think about it. So it took me 2 years to get around to it. Yes, for those of you who are curious, I recorded a podcast with Sam Harris yesterday. We had planned to go somewhere in the neighborhood of an hour, but 2 hours into it, we had to call it because he had the studio booked for something else after. So I won't. You won't actually have access to the podcast for at least a week. It takes him a little while to do whatever he does to process it. I won't tell you how it went, but I think it'll be one of the most interesting things you've ever heard. For 2 hours anyway. I'll give you the highlights. The highlights are that he and I got along great. We obviously disagreed on a lot of Trump-related stuff. But the great thing about a podcast, as opposed to a television show, and this is really a huge deal. On a television show, one side talks, the other side talks, you run out of time, nothing gets settled, and everybody's left with more to say that probably was important, but you're just down of time. On the podcast, though, since it doesn't have to be any special length, you can just make sure you say everything you wanted to say. So that's sort of what we did. And let me tell you that roly-poly, you're going to love it. That's all I'm going to say. How did you record it? Used Zenly or something. There's a service that records it in a Skype-like atmosphere, but without Skype. All right, so now that many of you are here, I thought I would take the time to solve this healthcare problem. And I know you're thinking, you're not going to solve healthcare on a periscope, but I might, because this idea is actually good enough that it might. So here's the idea. You know that I've spoken often and written often about the importance of doing small-scale trials of any new program that you think you might want to do in a widespread way. Now, that's the way any business would operate. It's the way the government should operate, but hasn't done that well, completely in the past. Healthcare is the perfect situation for doing a small-scale test. Yeah, and doing some A/B testing. Maybe you do more than one test. But there was always one problem with testing healthcare. The people who have money and who have good healthcare, well, they don't want to experiment too much, right? Because they got what they need. And you can't ethically or politically do a test on poor people who can't afford their own insurance. So even if you had, great new technology that you thought was great, it would represent a little bit of extra risk. And politically, you can't say to yourself, hey, we've got an idea. We're going to have a different kind of, special program for the people who don't have money, but it's risky. That's a hard program to sell, putting your risk on the poor people. so that the rich people don't have to pay more money, right? So you have a built-in problem with healthcare in particular, trying to figure out what's a way to do a test on a low-cost version of healthcare. Now, you know that Ted Cruz has introduced a low-cost option, but the reason it's low cost is that it's apparently low value, right? That it leaves a lot on the table. So people are pushing back against that. So here's my idea for a way to do a test of healthcare that would allow the administration to say, our plan is to get to 100% coverage. Here's how we get there. Now, in the short run, they would not be necessarily offering more coverage than Obamacare, but they could show a path to get there. And here's what it would look like. And this is the least amount of effort that the government could put into this, and that should be why you like it as well. The government could say, I'm going to declare Silicon Valley, and only Silicon Valley, a special healthcare zone. And here's the thing we're going to test. We're going to let Silicon Valley develop its own healthcare plan, probably with some kind of a social kind of mechanism, so that people would self-organize and they would create some kind of a GitHub type service. Those of you who don't know what GitHub is, for people who are developers, programmers, there's a website called GitHub where people keep the code that they've written that they think would be useful for other people for other projects. So people put all their good ideas in one place for programming, and then other programmers and developers have access to it. Imagine doing the same thing with healthcare. Just take a GitHub model, and then everybody in Silicon Valley can say, well, I have an idea for this little part of healthcare, like how to do just this part. I have an idea for insurance. I have an idea for this technology. I have an idea for virtual doctors, whatever it is. And then they all have their own little section on GitHub, and then they start working on developing that first as ideas, and then as actual products later. But here's the key to this. Instead of testing this new inexpensive or even free form of insurance, you make it available only to people above a certain income. Think about it. While it's in trial phase, in the long run, you want to make this available to everybody and to poor people in particular. But during the trial only, you make it available only to people above a certain income. In other words, people who are well off and have an option of buying their own insurance. And those people could actually just keep their own insurance at the same time, but they could work simultaneously on sometimes using this free system as it's being developed. So now you say to yourself, why would these rich people, engineers and technology people mostly in Silicon Valley want to use an experimental kind of a healthcare if they had their own insurance that's a full form that does everything they want? Well, if you're wondering that, you have never spent any time in Silicon Valley, right? The reason that engineers and technologists would be working on this, even though they don't need it because they have insurance, is because it's a challenge. And they can't stand a challenge that is unaddressed. No engineer can be around a problem without working on it. They just don't have that capacity. If there's a problem and you put an engineer next to it, the engineer doesn't look away. They're just not designed that way. They can't do it. You put them near a problem and they're going to say, I don't have time for this. But if you just change that one thing, all right? So that's the nature of the valley, is if you say Silicon Valley is a special healthcare zone, and the only thing the government's going to do is a little bit of organizing up front so everybody knows what's happening, and then they will take requests to remove temporarily at first, and maybe permanently later, but temporarily, any healthcare restrictions or any government guidelines and restrictions that would prevent a test of something in this special healthcare zone. Let's say, for example, somebody in Silicon Valley says, we've already developed this medical device, but instead of going through testing for 2 years, when we know there's nothing about this that could possibly be dangerous by its nature, can we get to the front of the line of the FDA or just skip it just for this device? And then the government takes that request and says, well, we wouldn't do it for anybody, but we're going to do it for the special healthcare zone because you guys are geniuses, you're literally PhDs, you know what you're doing, and everybody who uses this already has their own health insurance. They know the risks, they know what they're doing. Nobody's forced to do anything. So if anybody wants to try this new device, give them full disclosure, make sure that they're capable people, and then let them choose. So what you would be doing is running this essentially free service that's being developed as you go with people who have their own insurance in case they need it. So, if something comes up, they say to themselves, hey, does this free service yet have something I could use? Because it might be easier. So for example, let's say your regular doctor requires you to go in person to the doctor, but you've got a small problem. And your free service that you're working on the side has a virtual doctor or Watson or, some computer diagnostics. Well, you'd probably prefer it, at least to try it first. Try the free one that's cooler, better, and available right there. See what happens. If you're not happy with it, you have your own insurance. You're a rich guy. You've got insurance. Go to your regular doctor if you don't like it. So in this way, you would take all of the risk away from poor people. You would put all of the risk on the people who were most capable of understanding it. Engineers, technical people, people with high incomes, people who have options. They keep their regular insurance. Nobody has to use it while it's in test phase. Then you could imagine, tweaks to selling insurance across boundaries. You could imagine that there would be a hospital or two in Silicon Valley who would be sort of let's say the mentors to this. So they'd be sort of a clearinghouse for, talking to the government about the ideas. So that if you're in Silicon Valley and you need the government to get rid of a regulation or a rule, you go to your hospital, talk to the doctors, and the doctors say, well, normally I wouldn't ask them to get rid of this rule, but in this special case, it does sort of make sense. So then it's the hospital that asks the government, so that actually doctors are doing the requesting. So imagine, if you will, that the president just said, I'm going to make Silicon Valley a special healthcare zone. You can ask for, and in many cases you will be given, exemptions from federal and maybe even state guidelines, as long as you're not making poor people use this risky new low-cost insurance while you're working it out. All right. So does anybody have an obvious problem with that? Because I'm pretty sure that Silicon Valley could cobble together from assets that already exist, because there's just a ton of new stuff in the medical field, new ideas and stuff. They could probably cobble something together that would work almost right out the gate. The poor won't like it, but they're not going to use it until the bugs are worked out of it, and until it's easy enough for anybody to use it. Who will own it? So that's the beauty, is that nobody would own it. Nobody owns healthcare. It's just a bunch of services that perhaps you have an app that tells you how to do it. Perhaps you have some, social media way to solve problems. Perhaps you're sharing medical assets, whatever things you actually can share safely. That sort of thing. Is this only for diagnostics? No. It would also be for treatment. So let's say, for example, you were I'll give you some examples. Let's say you were a Johnson & Johnson, and you wanted to test, one or two new devices, medical devices, and you needed a facility that's willing to do that. So you go to the hospital that's within the special healthcare zone, and you say, I will fund all the treatment for this customer, or patient, I should say, in this room while they're being treated, as long as you also use my device. And again, you need smart people to say that this would be a safe thing to do in this specific case. But you could probably get a lot of the big pharma companies, the big medical device companies, to fund treatment in return for getting information about the treatment for their own purposes. So there's probably a lot of deals you could work like that. Will it cover, well, the idea is you would cover as many things as new technology knows how to do cheaply, and then you would have a kind of a spillover thing for the things that you can't do yet. So that would just be treated within, regular medical care. So one of the things that you could imagine being tested would be, just throw out some ideas. One would be people who agree to be monitored all the time. So they put whatever sensors they need. It might be just a Fitbit. It might be, one other thing or more. And they just agree that they'll just be monitored all the time. They'll just give up their privacy for health-related stuff. And in return, companies that need that information pay them. And that payment might be, partly taking off some of the cost of their health care. Now, keep in mind that you don't have to evaluate how smart any one of my example ideas is, because the point of it is that if you do this in Silicon Valley, the quality of the ideas will be better than whatever comes out of my mouth, and there will be lots of them. And there'll be lots of things to A/B test against other things. The invention of the incubator. Main problem is to see how well to assess. Yeah, I mean, it's not like there's one problem with this. There are lots of problems with this idea, but that's why you put it in Silicon Valley. You take the thing that has lots of problems and you put it in the place that has the most problem solvers that there have ever been in one place at one time in the history of the world. They're the best problem solvers who have ever lived. And you give them the biggest problem. Here's the biggest problem in the country that's, something that can be done within the country. And it's up to you guys, Silicon Valley, go solve this. I think you'd find some billionaires stepping up. I think you'd find a lot of people who wanted to work on it. It might even become a badge of honor if you're doing something on it. Biggest problem is abortion. I don't know in what sense. Yeah, I certainly think that the diagnostic stuff you could do. Let me say this: suppose Silicon Valley figured out how to get the diagnostics down to almost free. That would be something. And then suppose that the physical part, where you've got to put a cast on somebody, you've got to do an operation, that sort of thing. Suppose you started doing that with robots, or at least remote, real doctors manipulating robots in the operating room. All that stuff exists, right? It just has to be brought to a better level. Yeah, so it'd be anybody could contribute to the ideas through a site like GitHub. Opioids and treatment facilities. Opioids are a big problem. I would love to see a list, from top to bottom of the highest costs, where we're wasting the most money in healthcare down to the least, and see what we can do about the top 50 things. Opioids. Yeah, I would agree that opioids are, however big a problem you think they are, I'm going to say that's times 10. The thing with opioids is if it doesn't hit somebody you know or somebody in your family or you personally, you you don't really understand how big a deal it is. Did all of you see? Did you see the video of Shia LaBeouf getting arrested and spewing his racist thoughts and stuff? Now, I don't know what he was on, but I'm guessing alcohol wasn't the only thing. I'm going to guess opioids, but that's just a guess based on the way he alcohol was obviously also involved. Opioids would be not just heroin, it would be stuff like OxyContin. Basically pain kills that your doctor would give you. So, yeah. Oh, can I summarize my plan? So the idea, the healthcare plan, if you're just coming in, would be, let's say, this is just brainstorming here, that the government says to Silicon Valley only, we're going to give you special attention, and you're going to become a healthcare test zone where you try to create a healthcare program that works for you guys. I'm gonna look out my front door and see if that's a package. If I get murdered on Periscope, you're all my witnesses. Okay. Come on in. I'm live on Periscope. All right. All right, I'm going to sign off. I've said everything I need to say. Bye for now. I'm glad I could solve healthcare for you.